I just want to do God's will.
What you're seeking is a blessing from God.
You must expect a miracle.
You have the power of choice.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Life Today Live. I have a question for you. Can you still succeed in America and other places around the world? Canada, nods to you guys up there. That is actually a hotly debated question these days. And you know, I just having conversations with my own kids who are all in their 20s, I know there's some skepticism even amongst the people that were raised in the church. There's a sense of victimhood out there, and there are victims out there. So how do you balance the realities of difficulty, struggles, poverty, family circumstances, ethnicity issues that create tension, and Lord knows that's a focus point right now. How do you handle all these things? And then you throw in faith. Does that really have an impact? Where can you go? Good questions. Well, we're going to talk to someone who hasn't just pondered these questions, but lived it out. And he's successful today, and he's got some good things to say, and he's saying it to people that need to hear it. And I thought maybe you would enjoy hearing it today. So I'm excited to have David Morales on. He has a new book. It looks like this, just out this month, called Familia. And it's a memoir of perseverance. And that is a theme that I think we don't like to preach about a lot, but it's key to success. One of many, and we're going to hear from it. David, great to have you on Life Today Live.
Thank you, Randy. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
So let's jump into some of your story, give people a background so that we can see how these lessons that you're teaching others apply to them. Take us back to your homeland.
Sure. So my personal story starts with Puerto Rico. We'll talk later about further, because I like to talk about my family. It goes way back further to my grandfather and father, but starts with Puerto Rico. We grew up very low income. We grew up in a town named Dorado. There's two sides of it. There's the beachfront side, which folks who like to vacation are familiar with if they've gone to those hotels. And then on the other side of this highway called La Número Dos, the number 2 route, is where I grew up, on the mountainside, working class, low income, etc. We grew up struggling. I grew up wearing my brothers and sisters' clothing. Just to be very candid, we didn't have much. My parents worked really hard. My father had several jobs. I speak about in the book, Familia, about his income, very low income. And my mother had an administrative job, got by teaching English in the schools as well. And then I grew up with my brothers and one sister. My sister was like my second mom. She was home after school with me. My 2 brothers, a bit older than me by 7 years. And we just grew up figuring it out. Difficult, very difficult. But I have to say that what was extremely important during those formative years was my family. Mm-hmm. My brothers and sisters, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles all lived around us. And despite the challenges, everybody came together to persevere and figure things out together. So as difficult as things were, family was a pivotal and important part of my life while I growing up in Puerto Rico.
A little bit of a sidetrack here. I've noticed that in areas that there tends to be a lot of poverty. I mean, I've seen that. You saw this with a lot of the early Italian Americans. I've seen it in Ireland. You've seen it a lot of different cultures, but I think when there's poverty, the family tends to stick together. And now you've been here, in the mainland for a long time. We seem to forget that when we become successful. Have you noticed that too, or am I just?
There's no question, Randy. Part of the reason why I wrote the book, one of the many reasons, is because our family is still very close. Mm-hmm. That has been an essential ingredient of our success as Hispanics in the United States of America, what I call the greatest country in the world. What I perceive, frankly, growing up in the United States and perceive today with my son's friends and my nieces and nephews' friends, is that the family is not core. Largely, there's one parent in the home, And these children are not getting foundational values, what I call American or conservative values at home. They're learning other values either on TV or on the street. And that anchor of your foundation as an individual is missing from the home, the family.
I think what that sets up is the opposite trajectory of what you did, because I've seen a lot of people come from a solid core foundation where family is important and become successful. And I think if we don't have that, I think we might be sending kids in the other way. But we talk a little more about that as we get into it. But I want to get more into your story. So take us from poverty in Puerto Rico to how you got to where you're at today, because you're very successful in business. And of course, you're living here in a very cold part of the United States right now. So we'll take us along your journey a bit more.
Sure, absolutely. So it really starts with my parents. My mother was, still is a praying mother. We're very faith-based. We're believers and followers of Jesus Christ. My mother, my sister, my aunts, all prayer warriors. And so after several years, many years, I should say, of my father struggling through Puerto Rico and through alcoholism, candidly, on weekends, we used to go find food. We used to go to the mountains. We used to go in Puerto Rico. There's, at least when I was growing up, there was a lot of fruit and vegetables in the mountains that you could just get for free. You'd get plantains, you get your yams or your batatas, all free. You'd get a big bag for the week. And frankly, that helped serve us for 4 or 5 days. And so one particular weekend, my father went alone. And this is him retelling me the story when I was writing the book. I asked him how he came to Christ, and he told me that it was one Saturday morning where he came up empty. He didn't get anything, and he broke down. This is now, my father, just for context, is a former Navy, very robust man, very, if you think of sort of machismo in the old school Latin American, very male, that was my father. And so to hear the story of him breaking down and asking God for help on his knees on a mountainside of Puerto Rico was powerful for me. And so he tells me that essentially he went to church and the pastor told him, we've been praying for you and you should think about leaving, going to the United States. That's where your future is. That's where you're going to help your family. And so 3 years later, after my father had come to the United States, he brought us back here. My father came first. My oldest brother, who graduated from high school, came the day after he graduated high school, gets on a plane to help my father. And they brought us here to Lynn, Massachusetts, the opposite of Puerto Rico. So in Puerto Rico, you had like rural working class farms, poverty, et cetera. And here we get to like tenement homes and triple deckers of New England, cold weather, low income, poverty, et cetera. And so we come to a place where, frankly, it was the first time I realized we were poor. In Puerto Rico, at least we had food, we had clothing, we had a shelter. It was great. And as a little kid, everything was good. And when I got here on 11, 12 years old, it was a shock. We were not we didn't have much.
Yeah. So how did you get out of that? I mean, that's a tough situation for anybody. But the culture shock, I don't know how good your mother taught English, so that probably wasn't as big of a barrier. But the poverty, I mean, that's a place where a lot of people don't ever get out of.
Yeah. Look, it's really what's interesting about my family is we're a microcosm of America. We were then, and we still are. We had, frankly, a brother who did not do as well. At least financially and materialistically, as my other brother and my sister. And so to answer your question, we made different choices. We had a wonderful foundational element of family and faith. My father, I can remember that my father, a few weeks into us getting here, sat us down and said, we're going to work our way out of this. Everyone's going to work. This is America. We work here. My mother at the same time says, we speak English. We're going to learn English, we're going to speak English, and we're going to work. This is not our final state. And I grew up watching my parents lead by example. I grew up watching them work sometimes 2 or 3 jobs. I grew up watching them struggle. I grew up watching my brother Dan work 4 or 5 jobs. I watched him get very successful fast. And this is a guy who started out working in Wendy's. And so I started watching the driving determinant factors that made up my brothers and my brother and my parents. It was faith, it was hard work, it was determination, perseverance, and frankly, a DNA that doesn't take no for an answer. There was no to my father, there were no obstacles despite him being a quote unquote blue collar low income worker. If he had to work 3 jobs, he'd work them. He'd always tell us, I don't care what happens, there will always be food on the table. We'll find a way. And so I grew up watching these determined folks figure out how to sustain the family. The other thing that was happening was my mother used to tell me all the time, God has a plan for you. And it's not to be here, it's to prosper and to do great things. You are anointed, David, to do wonderful things. And I heard this stuff every day, Randy. And to this day, it drives my DNA. I never take no for an answer. I see opportunities where people see obstacles, but it was frankly a foundational element that my parents helped to instill in me, and that as a young boy, I started perceiving from my parents. Later on through high school, there were also some, I call them guardian angels that God put in my life who were doing the same thing for me, showing me foundational values, showing me how to do things, showing me by their actions how I should be thinking and speaking in society, et cetera.
So let me ask you this just sort of philosophical question, because we start to talk about this, especially when we come from a faith background, Christian background. There's a balance. I don't believe poverty is from God. I don't think the constant state of need and hunger and destitution is from God. At the same time, both of us, I'm sure, agree that materialism is not from God too, So there's a balance somewhere. How do you define success?
Yeah, great question. Let me first address your points because I appreciate them and I agree with them. Poverty is a spirit, right? It is not from God. It is also a mental state that you can beat. So I totally agree with you, and I take it one step further. You can beat it. How do I define success? So let me be clear. Success is not about money. Success is not about materialistic goods. That's why I said earlier, I learned that I was poor when I came to the United States materialistically. I define success as health, family, and grace. That's it. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care how many things you have. If you have your family, you have health, and you have God's love, you're a multi-billionaire in this country. Simple. Or wherever you live. And so from my point of view, I think what I've seen in my life, and frankly, it led to me to make a very different decision several years ago as an executive. Money and the love of money, as the Bible says, is not just the root of evil. It'll help you get lost. And so money is a tool we should leverage, right? Yep. God tells us to work, to earn and produce, but not to love money. And so success for me is very simple. My family, my health, and God's love and grace. That's success. I have those in abundance. And when people ask me how I'm doing, I tell them I'm blessed. I'm absolutely better than I deserve.
That's good. And I think as we have sort of carved God out of much of the public lives, and that's sort of trickled into the families, and you get into the brokenness of families, not having that definition has led to a myriad of definitions and frustrations, and it just seems to be a lot of aimlessness out there in people these days. What are you seeing out there? Because as you're presenting this to people, especially younger men, what do you see that they're missing that is getting them off track?
Very deep question, Randy. Multifactorial, from my perspective. Let's start with home. There are statistics and data that anyone can research that show that prior to 1965, the African American home was over 70% mother-father, right? Hispanic, same thing, over 85%. Today, those numbers are abysmal. They're in the 20s and 45%, respectively. not good. So number one, the home. Number two, when you think about what we're teaching our kids in schools, we've taken God out of schools. We're taking God out of the popular culture. We're prioritizing money. We're prioritizing individualism as the thing. What happens to a young man or woman? They start believing that their identity is not in Christ, but in gold or in popularity or in tweets or number of likes. And so those are two factors. And a third factor is we are continuing to elevate people on TV that might be dribbling a rubber basketball. Not that there's nothing wrong with basketball,
Right.
but guess what? Dribbling a rubber basketball does not take a lot of skill. No disrespect. I played football in high school and in college, did it well, but butting heads with helmets doesn't take a lot of skill. It takes tenacity. I'd rather present somebody who has had an incredible life as 25 years as a mailman, delivering mail and being gracious to people as somebody who you should look up to. I'd rather point to a physician or a doctor who's running a hospital and say to the young man or young woman, aspire to be the doctor, not the nurse. Not that there's anything wrong with being the nurse. I'd rather say to a young man or woman, look, you see that pastor over there who fought in World War II? Aspire to be that person. You don't need to aspire to be the person dribbling the basketball. So there's a lot of factors that we in popular culture today have done or look up to that don't make sense, that have taken God out of the core values of individuals, and number two, have taken the family structure out of what we should be prioritizing. So multifactorial, but those are two key elements: God and family.
Yeah, and I think what I hear you saying is just to not denigrate basketball or nurses or anything like that, but to say that you need to get your direction and your identity from something better than culture or other people that don't understand. And without God in the picture, it kind of leaves you guessing and kind of shooting in the dark. And when we find our identity first with God, well, then we find our place in the world. And
That's
we're
right.
comfortable wherever he puts us, whether it's heading up that hospital, running for office, or throwing
That's
the
right.
football, whatever, So,
Yeah. And look, I want to be clear, Randy. Again, it's not about denigrating anybody or their role. It's about, to your point, understanding who you are. When somebody asks me who I am, I don't say I run a health plan. What I say is I am a son of Christ and I am blessed, right? It is understanding who you are. And number two, understanding that God put you here for a bigger purpose. If your purpose is to inspire people by dribbling a ball, that's all good. I'm good with it. But do not position that is the greatest thing in the world for everybody. Right. It's not. It might be for you, but not for everybody.
Yep, I hear you, and that's exactly right. That's exactly right. All right, we're talking to David Morales. He has a book out now that talks about his life, his experiences, and the things he's gone through. There's way more than what we're being able to touch on right now. It's available. It's called American Familia. It looks just like this, and you can get that wherever you get books. You can also check out his website. It's at davidmorales.com. Do I have an A? Is it davidamorales.com?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
that's correct then. On the screen, right there, that's correct. David A. Morales. I'm guessing there's more than one David Morales in the United States or in the world. So, David A. Morales. I'm glad I double-checked that. Okay. Briefly, before I ask a really loaded question coming up, give people a little bit of an idea of what you do, because I've talked about your success, and you touched on running the healthcare stuff. Give it just a brief bio so people understand where you're at right now.
Sure. So today I run a health plan. I am honored to do that. I run a health plan in Massachusetts. We administer basically health coverage for about 200,000 people in Massachusetts. Okay. Before that, I worked in the administering and leading hospitals across several states in the United States. And before that, I was commissioner of healthcare in Massachusetts. And then I was in government at the highest levels in Massachusetts for about 12 years.
So safe to say you're not forced to take public transportation. No problem with it. I take it some, but you have your own car, you have your own house. You're comfortable financially.
I am blessed.
Okay. As you came to America as what I think we still consider a minority, Hispanic, Puerto Rican, whatever, but definitely not much in your pocket. Did you ever feel like white people were trying to keep you down? Honest answer, because I know I'm white.
Yeah, it's a great question. So let me be really blunt. I'm a very transparent person, Randy, so I'm going to be transparent here too.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up in high school, and some of this is in the book. Growing up in high school, and by the way I set up the book was a conversation between a father and two sons. Okay. It's not about the family memoir. It's about a discussion between a father and the two sons. And so that part of the book is really important because I grew up in high school, frankly, there was like this dichotomy that I still don't frankly understand at all, especially here in Massachusetts of like white, black. White people are your enemy and us brown people stick together. That's how I grew up understanding this thing in high school. And so you'll see in the book, I started challenging that notion. I says, well, wait a second. We can't go up to this place called Pine Hill back then. We can't go up there? Well, why not? I can go up there. What's stopping us? Well, let's go. And so I grew up understanding that. When I get to college, Randy, the script blew up on me. I got to college and I started realizing, well, time out. Here are these very, very wealthy, white, wealthy blacks who all went to private schools. And I had more in common with the low-income potato farmers in northern Maine or the farmers from Tennessee who are all like me, low income. And so I started realizing, time out, this whole race thing is not it. What I started realizing more and more, it was all about social class, income.
Yeah.
We had similar experiences that the lower income tiers, we were very similar, but we had different tones or spoke different languages. And yet the folks from the higher classes who went to elite schools, especially the blacks and Hispanic kids, wanted nothing to do with, no disrespect, with the ghetto Hispanic kid from London. And I realized for me, more and more, even today, it was about income. And even when I traveled as an executive at a big hospital company, look, black folks at the tables in different countries across the world, multimillionaires, right? But you can't do that if you don't have money. And so I started understanding the world from the perspective of, it's not about race. You can buy your way in if you have money. So maybe it's not the race.
That's very interesting. And I definitely, I wouldn't challenge that notion. And race is not biblical. Race is not actually scientific. It's a man-made construct. And I think as Christians, we should just reject it entirely and get back to the gospel. Love your neighbor as yourself. Then yes. That's the solution right there. So it's interesting to get your perspective on it. If there's anything else you want to add, please do. But before we wrap up, I want to get back to the message that God's put on your heart. The reason you tell your story, your family's story, the reason you even take the time out of your busy, successful life to even do this. What is it that you feel like God's put on your heart to communicate?
Yeah, it's very simple. We must, as Americans, embrace faith, family, and grit. We must. This is the greatest country in the world. I've worked in 3 different countries, 11 states here in America. There is no place like America, none. We are blessed to have constitutional values that were breathed by God. Freedom to pursue happiness, liberty. And so from my point of view, I've been called to inspire young men, especially young men and women, of course, but young men to stand up and say, there is a different path. Embrace your faith, God, embrace your family, steward them, nurture them, embrace perseverance and grit. There are no obstacles in America except one, and that's the person looking at you in the mirror. That's it.
That's it, but if this younger generation could get it, it would change everything. You keep mentioning this word grit, and I want to show people your podcast called Grit Machine DNA. Talk about that real quick.
Sure. It's a phrase that I took from my high school football coach, David Dempsey, another angel that God put in my life. He changed my life. My sophomore year, he noticed how hard I worked, and he said, we're going to convert you into Grit Machine DNA. And 3 years later, I was an all-star in the region. But boy, grit is where it's at. If you don't have grit, it's hard to do things. You have to have grit. Approach everything with tenacity.
Yeah, that's good. All right. You can check out that podcast at David's website, davidamorales.com, as well as the book. And I would encourage you to do it. David, I appreciate I appreciate. Well, let me ask you before okay. Last question. Are you getting criticism and pushback for saying this? Because there's a lot of people that don't like what you're saying.
You know, I've had 3 different two very blunt and a third, but 3 different conversations with people that I've worked with in the past, all telephonic, who are surprised by what I'm saying. And, you know, what I say to them is, look, I respect your point of view. We're going to disagree to disagree, and that's one of the beauties of America. But at the end of the day, I am being called to speak what I believe is truth. So my view on criticism is everybody gets a point of view. We have a First Amendment. You get to just say what you say, and I get to say what I say. But the difference is, Randy, I stand on 2,000 plus years of biblical truth, and I'm comfortable with it.
I love it. You keep doing it. And again, I appreciate you taking the time to share with our audience, and just appreciate you pointing back to God. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Randy. Appreciate
you guys all watching out there. Hit share, pick up the book, check out the website, the podcast, and come back. This is good. This will work. Share this with people and subscribe or follow if you haven't done that. We'll see you again next time here on Life Today Live.
The gods of lust, the gods of secularism, the gods of indifference, the gods of amusement, the gods of all kinds of materialism that are rampant throughout America tonight. And God says you'll have to make a choice.